Hello, welcome to an online lecture looking at the types of errors that do not require a suspense account. I'm Gareth. Well, if you remember your basic principles of a suspense account is required when the trial balance doesn't balance. And the trial balance won't balance if one of your original double entries doesn't balance. If you, for instance, post a single-sided double entry, so let's say you only post a credit to bank of 100 and you don't have a corresponding debit, then ultimately the trial balance isn't going to balance, so you would need a suspense account. Well, what about errors where we do not require a suspense account? Well, these are errors where the original double entry does balance. So we have posted a balancing debit and credit. They're just wrong in some way, but they do at least balance. Now, if they do still balance, then the trial balance would still balance, so there wouldn't be a suspense account required. Now, there's actually 4 major types of error that you need to be aware of, and it's worth learning the names of these errors. They do have special names, starting with an error of omission. Now, an error of omission is where a transaction has been completely missed or omitted from the accounting system. So we just haven't posted anything at all. We haven't posted a debit and we haven't posted a credit. So let's say the payment of salaries has not been posted to any ledger accounts. Well, since there's no debit and no credit, then the trial balance would still balance, so no suspense account would be required. However, we do have an error that needs to be corrected. We've missed out an entire transaction. So an error of omission is where you've omitted both debit and credit. And in fact, to correct an error of omission, we just need to build in the double entry we should have posted. So if we've missed some salaries being paid, all we'd need to do is debit the salaries expense as it should have been, let's say £100 to show the expense we've suffered, and credit bank for the amount of money going out of the bank account. So effectively all you need to do with an error of omission is to post the double entry you should have posted in the first place. So that's an error of omission. We've then got an error of commission. And be careful not to confuse the two names, they do sound fairly similar. Now, an error of commission is where a double entry has been posted, but one side of it's been posted to the wrong account. So for instance, let's say we're paying salaries, but it was posted as a debit to telephone expense of £100 rather than to the salaries expense with a credit to the bank of 100. Now, there is a double entry that balances here. We've got a debit of 100 and a credit of 100. So this will not affect the suspense account. The trial balance would still balance in this case. But we've got a problem. We've recognised a telephone expense when it was nothing to do with the telephone. This was salaries. So effectively what I need to do to correct this one is need to eliminate that telephone expense that I recognised, which actually didn't exist. So I'm going to credit the telephone expense by 100 to eliminate the original debit balance. And I'm going to put the debit where it should have been in the first place. Debit the salaries expense, the 100, to recognise what I did spend the money on. So that's an error of commission where we did post a double entry. We just put one side of it to the wrong account. We've then got an error of principle. Now, an error of principle is like a more serious error than the error of commission. Because if you look back at the error of commission we just made, yes, we debited the wrong expense. We debited telephone initially when it should have been salary, but at least we were debiting an expense. You can perhaps imagine that I've still recognised a cost in my business. It was just the wrong cost. So in fact, my profit at the end of the year would actually still be correct. I would just be knocking off a figure as a telephone expense rather than as a salaries expense. But either way, they get knocked off your profit for the period. So you could argue the error of commission is not that big a deal. The profit will still be correct. The figures on the balance sheet would actually still be correct. All I'd have done is to misanalyze one of my costs. An error of principle is a much more serious problem. What if we'd posted the payment of salaries as a debit to machinery asset of 100 and a credit to bank of 100? Now, in this case, rather than recognising an expense of the business, can you see we've actually recognised an asset? That's a much more serious problem because we've now not recognised the salaries expense. That you can perhaps imagine means that our profit for the year is going to be higher than it should be because we've not recognised an expense we've incurred. And because we've recognised it as an asset, you can imagine the size of the balance sheet is going to be bigger. So in fact, this error is going to have a much more serious impact on our accounts than the error of commission that we looked at. So errors of principle are much more serious problems. In this case, we're recognising an asset instead of an expense, rather than just confusing the type of expense that we're recognising. Now, the double entry we've posted there does balance. We do have a balancing double entry. We do have a debit of 100 and a credit of 100. So this would not affect the trial balance. This would not require a suspense account. But there is a problem. And this problem would affect the profit for the period and the assets on the balance sheet. Both of those would be artificially inflated by this error. So the double entry, I would need to correct this. Well, we've recognised the machinery asset as a debit. That wasn't a machinery asset. That's rubbish. So I need to eliminate the machinery asset. So we'll credit machinery asset to effectively cancel out that debit we originally posted. And we'll debit salaries expense to show where it should have been in the first place. So effectively we're now eliminating the asset that's not a true asset. That'll correct the balance sheet. And we're now recognising the expense as it should be, which will hopefully correct the statement of profit or loss. But again, because the original double entry balanced, you'll see the correcting journal does not affect the suspense account there. And then the final type of error that does not require a suspense account is if we have what's called a reversed double entry, which literally means we just get the double entry exactly the wrong way around. So where we're paying salaries, we debit the bank by 100. Now that's wrong because paying salaries reduces your asset of bank. Therefore, you should have credited it. And we've credited salaries expense 100, which is also wrong. That should be the debit side. So they've literally got the transaction the wrong way round. But the double entry does balance, doesn't it? We have debited 100 to somewhere and credited 100 to somewhere. We've just done the debit and the credit the wrong way around. Now, to correct this, well, if you imagine what we've done here, we've debited bank by 100 when we should have credited bank by 100. That means bank's actually going to be out by a total of 200. Because we've debited it, we've added to the bank account when we should have reduced it. And if we've added 100 when we should have reduced it by 100, it'll be out by a total of 200. So I think I need to credit the bank by a total of 200 in this example, which you can perhaps imagine is going to cancel out the original incorrect debit they made and then put in the correct credit they should have done in the first place. So I need to credit bank by double the amount of the original posting. And similarly, they credited salaries expense when they should have debited it. So in fact, the salaries expense will be out by 200 as well. We need to post a total debit to salaries expense, therefore, of 200, which you can imagine will firstly cancel the credit they posted and then put in the debit as it should have been. So we need to debit salaries expense by a total of 200 here and credit the bank by a total of 200. As usual, you can see that my correcting journal there has balance debit against credit. And the thing you'll hopefully notice with each of these types of errors is because the original double entry balanced, then none of the correcting journals require an impact on the suspense account. The first one was debit salaries expense, credit bank, no impact on the suspense account. Second one, debit salaries expense, credit telephone expense, no impact on the suspense account. Third one was debit salaries expense, credit machinery asset, no impact on the suspense account. And that final one was debit salaries expense, a total of 200, credit the bank, a total of 200, no impact on the suspense account. And that's because in each case, the original double entry posted was wrong, but at least it balanced. So therefore, no impact on the trial balance and no impact on the suspense account.